service for peace in Magdeburg Cathedral. In communist East Germany in the late 1980s, hundreds came to services like these. In 1989, the numbers rose to thousands and eventually tens of thousands. After 40 years of dictatorship masquerading as the German Democratic Republic, the people in the walled-in eastern part of Germany were demanding their freedom. Many went first to church before demonstrating peacefully on the streets, where the security forces were just waiting for an incident which would enable them to intervene.
We know that here in Magdeburg, the 4,500 worshippers in the cathedral were confronted by security forces numbering between 10 and 20,000. It took enormous courage to face up to them in the darkened city squares, with the buses that had been brought in to take away the detainees, the water cannon, the heavily armed police. Chin up was the motto, but you were still weak at the knees. That was the challenge, and to have faced it, that was the breakthrough for me. I had conquered my own fear.
His fear was well-founded. The East German authorities had never been reticent when it came to persecuting and harassing dissidents. Those who wanted to leave the country were locked up or shot while trying to escape across the border. Like many clergy, Giselher Quast, a canon of Magdeburg Cathedral since 1979, was kept under surveillance by the secret police, the Stasi. He is to this day relieved that the mass uprising of 1989 went off so peacefully.
It was not least the church that prevented bloodshed and murder on the streets. Our revolution was peaceful, in contrast to, for example, Romania. I think that was due to the fact that people could only assemble in churches. Anywhere else, and it would have been classed as a subversive gathering. When you've held a candle in church, you don't go out and start throwing stones. I think we can thank the church for this non-violence.
The prayer meetings grew into huge protest demonstrations. Fortified by the general developments in Eastern Europe, the people of East Germany grew more courageous. By providing a place for the expression of protest, many churches also provided a safety valve for the pent-up rage and dissatisfaction at life under the communists. Together, they gave the discontent a voice.
Of course, 90% of the thousands of people who came to the cathedral were not Christians. That was a result of the socialization that we had after 40 years of communism. But even as non-Christians, they came to the microphone during the litany. Often, they were so agitated they could only stammer their desires. I had the impression this was a kind of secular prayer, the hope that someone would hear what was being said. These were the primordial religious elements that are present in everyone. That was very clear at the time, as was gratitude to the Church for providing this cover and making it all possible.
On the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall was opened, followed in the next few days by all the other border crossings between the two Germanies. The images were everywhere the same, as here on the legendary Glienicke Bridge, captured by an amateur movie maker. Neither the East German military nor the half-million-strong Red Army garrison stepped in. This was due to the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, whose policies of glasnost and perestroika had ushered in the end of the Cold War. The rapid collapse of communist East Germany was for everyone no less surprising than the peaceful nature of the revolution. The opening of the Hungarian border, the chance to get to the west via the West German embassy in Prague, the resulting flood of refugees had paved the way for this unique historic event. The border guards in particular found it hard to cast off old habits. 2 days after the wall was opened, there were still crossing points where papers were checked, even though the barriers had been dismantled. The authorities wanted to preserve a semblance of order at a border which officially still existed. The East German state still existed too, albeit with open borders and flowers for the soldiers. Since 1961, the border between East and West Germany had been one of the most heavily guarded in the world. Marksmen, electric fences and mines were in place to prevent any breaches. Since the Church of the Saviour lay directly on the border strip, the pastor had to hand over his keys to the army in 1961. No one apart from the soldiers was allowed anywhere near the church. In no man's land, the death zone between east and west, the building fell into dereliction. After 28 years, the barriers were opened and the military returned the church to the pastor and his congregation. It was in a state of advanced decay, the victim of orgies of destruction.
The figures of the apostles, for example, had been vandalized. Their faces had been battered off. Other pieces had been removed. They're probably lying around in someone's attic. To that extent, the Church of the Saviour is also an example of how faith and art were treated during the years of division, and of the arbitrary treatment of the faithful by the communist state.
Today, 20 years later, the Church of the Saviour has been restored to its former glory. It was lucky. Its prominent location on the banks of the Havel at the edge of Berlin and its closeness to prosperous Potsdam, where the Prussian Renaissance is still in full swing, meant there was no shortage of donors and sponsors to restore the building and reconstruct the interior, including the figures of the apostles. But while many church buildings fell into dilapidation under the communists, not all had the good fortune of the Church of the Saviour. Even large parishes often did not have the money to maintain their churches. But there was another side of the coin. The churches had an advantage that may well have played a decisive role during the peaceful revolution.
The church had an incredible advantage in East Germany. It was an autonomous institution. It had buildings, premises at its disposal, and it had a field of activity in which the state had no voice, in contrast to schools, for example. That was what gave us space.
In the very centre of East Berlin, the Church of St. Sophia provided young people in particular with just this space. Here, in spite of pressure from the state, they received support and gave each other courage to stand up and be critical, but above all, to follow the principle of non-violence. That was the important Christian message.
The message is based on the Sermon on the Mount, in particular in the beatitude, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Even in the early 1980s, when I was still a youth chaplain, we paid particular attention in our discussions on the theme of swords into plowshares, to making sure that our young people didn't draw attention to themselves by violent behaviour. That was our only chance. Our arguments were strong, and we were strong because we didn't counter violence with violence.
The state kept a very close watch on dissidents, but apart from its network of informers and its own constant surveillance, it could find no way of suppressing dissident activity.
This gave us a sort of inner calm. It enraged the security services because there's nothing worse for a security service than to see the force it uses not taken seriously.
Andreas Schulz is a youth deacon at the Church of St. Sophia in Berlin, as he was in 1989. Still imprisoned behind the wall in the eastern part of the city, young people met here in the Cellar Club in 1989. A major topic in the summer of that year was the relaxation of the travel regulations. On the 7th of May, the first crack had appeared in the Iron Curtain. It became possible to travel to the west via Hungary. Other Eastern Bloc countries followed suit, and thousands of people took the opportunity. Before taking his youthful charges on a church excursion to Hungary in June '89, the young deacon had to promise their parents that he would bring them all back.
We went to Budapest in a hopelessly overcrowded train. We didn't all have seats. Then we made it to Romania. But on the way back from Budapest, I can honestly say we were the only 9 people on the train from Budapest to Berlin.
9 young people who did not flee. While their parents had often come to live with the communist system in maybe too cozy an arrangement, it was mainly the young people who rebelled against it. Some protested by dropping out, as punks, for example. Others were more active, writing pamphlets, organising poster and flyer campaigns. And they did this in a dictatorship where it was hard to offer resistance, especially as a young idealist.
In our youth groups, we had a lot of students in the top years of high school, and for all their commitment, they had to worry about being expelled. I really must take my hat off to them, not least to their inner resistance, because every campaign they took part in could have put their continued schooling at risk.
Elke Kaminski taught at the Friedrich Schinkel High School in East Berlin. She was a loyal adherent of the regime. She had been brought up by her parents as a strict socialist and had joined the party at an early age. She was seen as a party high flyer. She became a teacher and achieved early promotion to become headmistress. Kaminski's coming, they said.
The thing with Kaminski's coming started in my childhood when I chaired the group council, organized parties, or simply as a schoolgirl, but above all when something had to be fought for. My father's motto was, "We have to fight for what we want."
Das Schlagwort meines Vaters lautete, wir müssen uns durchkämpfen im Leben. Und deshalb kam sie.
And I arrived in this building where we are now as headmistress. I got this opportunity as a very young woman and I used it. I was very proud to have become head of a school in the middle of the Prenzlauer Berg district. For 4 years, Kaminski came across the schoolyard at 7:30 almost every morning.
The Friedrich Schinkel School in Berlin's Prenzlauer Berg district was very popular with many parents at the time on account of its classical education. But by choosing the teachers carefully, the state also sought to exert its own influence.
I was one of those who were convinced communists, a fully committed member of the party. And it was just people like this who were employed in this school, because about 20% of the pupils came from Christian families. And this influence had to be met with strong counter-influence. And so Kaminski was chosen for the top job, because Kaminski was convinced she could cope with Christians.
As at all schools, the educational aim of the state was to produce conformist communists. But here, the students seemed to question and subvert these methods at an early age. Not even Elke Kaminski really succeeded in producing complete little communists. Because she occupied herself seriously with their questions and criticisms, the headmistress found herself having to personally confront the contradictions and weaknesses of the system.
I knew that there were things in East Germany that had to be examined and judged critically, things full of contradictions. What I said was always this: yes, it's all true what you tell me, especially in respect of the slowly collapsing economy. Yes, it's true, but for me, East Germany was my home, and I hoped that it would go on existing forever. It had to be improved and it had to be changed. That was my position.
When the wall came down, the headmistress lost her job. Today, Elke Kaminski is back at work as a teacher. Then she confused the state with the ideals it only pretended to represent. Today, she thinks back to the inspiration she received from some of her students.
It was the encounter with these people here. It was here that I first consciously noticed these Christian students, and they were generally the ones who did best at school. They enriched our parties with their cultural contributions. They could play instruments, they could sing, they were attentive, they were interested. They were critical in civics lessons, and yet so open and tolerant.
After the political upheaval, things weren't easy for Elke Kaminski at first. Her ideals were in ruins, her job was gone. But the former headmistress renovated her life just as the city renovated the buildings in her neighbourhood. The fact that her old school has been closed down is a sign for her that not everything in the new system is ideal. So it is all the more important for Elke Kaminski to have found a firm footing for herself.
A few years ago, there came a breakthrough. I went to a wonderful concert given by a splendid choir. They sang settings of texts by St. Paul. This music gave me goosebumps. I asked myself, who is or was this Paul? That was the occasion for me to look for the first time into a very thick and very old book, the Bible.
Der Auslöser dafür, das erste Mal in ein sehr dickes und altes Buch zu blicken, nämlich die Bibel. Und dann hat mich das Lesen.
I simply couldn't stop reading and asking questions.
Und ich wollte mehr wissen. Und so war die
I wanted to know more.
Konsequenz nicht aus.
Logically enough, I went to a church service. I found the rituals alien, but in this congregation I felt an incredible sense of shelter.
Ich fühlte mich im Kreis dieser Menschen unglaublich geborgen.
While Elke Kaminski turned to Christianity against the general trend, the churches themselves are emptying. Even in Magdeburg, only a handful of people still come to the traditional prayers for peace. Pastor Kvast, though, is confident, remembering that in 1989 his congregation was also small at first.
The punks came, and the peace groups, and the human rights groups, and the eco groups, and those who'd applied for exit visas, and the congregations gradually got bigger. After the wall came down, the numbers dropped. But on the 11th of September 2001, thousands suddenly arrived in the cathedral. So we need a place where the local people know they can find emotional shelter. When the football club were about to be relegated, they wanted to pray in the church. They did, though we couldn't avert the disaster, but they knew there was a place of hope where one could express solidarity, and these prayers for peace will always remain just that.
The experiences of those days have only reinforced Giselher Kvast's positive view of things, leaving a feeling of inner freedom and calm. To this day, he has remained non-conformist, critical and confident.
Under the communists, we had a saying, only dead fish swim with the current. And of course, in the church, we learned to be critical of the state right from the start, because it was the state that confronted us. We weren't a persecuted church, but a heavily confronted church. Time and again, we forced decisions, and in this situation, we played our part, and gladly. It didn't bother us that we were informed on and eavesdropped on, or that our phones were tapped and our letters opened. Nor did we ask who the informers in our ranks were. There were always informers in our ranks, because that would have paralyzed our work. Maintaining this inner freedom was maybe the strongest opposition.
The Stasi informers in the church congregations not only destroyed lives, above all they abused confidences. Neither international inquiry commissions nor those set up by the federal government were able to deal with the consequences of the surveillance carried out by the communist dictatorship.
The South Africans tried a little with their Truth Commission to confront people with the injustices they had committed in the hope that they would provide information and apologize, and that this would lead to reconciliation. We failed in our attempt to do the same. I think it was all done too quickly. Everyone was on their own and repressed their own stories and quickly looked around for a new job. It's only now that gradually people are saying, yes, I was in the Stasi, but this is always followed by, I didn't do anyone any harm though. This second sentence is fateful because it's not true. For the moment someone betrays another human being without telling them, "I'm employed to spy on you," he breaches a confidence. He violates the private sphere.
Elke Kaminski also felt betrayed by a system she believed in, and betrayed by a new society which provided her little support, and by a destiny that seemed to wish her no good. The collapse of her external world was followed by the collapse of her inner world. Her marriage broke up, and she was diagnosed with cancer. She has now overcome both her past and her illness.
Then these new experiences, these new impressions came pouring in. I needed to process them. I had really sworn to myself that I would no longer accept anything uncritically. I would question everything and rather ask 100 times than one too few. And maybe that was why, in the end, I came here and found a new home.
Against the advice of friends from the old days, and in spite of total incomprehension on the part of her family, Elke Kaminski rigorously pursued her new course.
I had this very great desire. It was to share in Holy Communion. And this was what caused the pressure within me to have myself baptized. I wanted to be there. I wanted to be part of this circle that offered their helping hands to each other. And on the night itself, it was very, very solemn here. I was one of 3 candidates for baptism. I was the eldest. It was so moving and special that it is one of the events that will remain in my memory forever.
Elke Kaminski has not become a conformist churchgoer, but she seems to have found in Christianity the values that her parents put across in the guise of socialism, values that foundered in the wreck of communist East Germany. Many of the once dilapidated facades have been restored to their former splendour. Parish pastor Friedhelm Wisislar has set the turbulent history of the Church of the Saviour to the tune of Mac the Knife. It's a song he likes to sing himself.
An der Havel steht ne Kirche, wie ein Schiff am sicheren Pier, einst gebaut von Preußens König Friedrich Wilhelm Nummer 4.
First and foremost, the Church of the Saviour is a parish church. We hold services twice a month, in addition to christenings, weddings, and funerals. We stage concerts and are now very happy we can play organ music from many centuries once more. As a result, this also makes our church a magnet for visitors.
Many of these visitors even hire a boat and make a display by mooring here and spending the most beautiful day of their lives in distinguished company. Of course, such a decision is motivated more by sentiment than by historical considerations.
When I was annoyed, I used to drive here to the park and run to the church and sit here for a couple of hours. Then everything was okay again. One day I drove here and said, "This is where I want to get married."
It is once more a place where dreams can come true. The dark traces of history have been swept away. In view of these pictures, it is hard to remember that this very spot was once a death strip whose guards had orders to shoot anyone trying to cross it. The oppressive history of the location is brought to mind by its close proximity to the Glienicke Bridge, one of the symbols of the Cold War, the division of Germany and the world between West and East. Until only a few years ago, spies were exchanged here and refugees hunted down. Only the different coats of paint still mark the formerly sharp division between East and West. The bridge has regained its old function, namely as a bridge to connect people. Since reunification, it has also symbolized German unity. 20 years after the wall came down, there is hardly a trace of the Cold War left. 20 years after the peaceful revolution, people steer their motorboats innocently across the lake, where once the border ran right across the water. And on the banks of the Havel, a church recalls the places from which the call to non-violence once went out.